Grief is a universal human emotion. It's something we all experience at some point in our lives, often unexpectedly, navigating through a complex set of emotions. The subject goes beyond cultural lines, affecting people in deeply personal ways. In today's episode, we'll explore the intersection of grief, loss, and mental health. Psychologist Amy Ramler shares how she works with clients in the grieving process and ways to approach grief in our own lives and how to support others. Welcome to Living Fully, a podcast dedicated to enhancing your mental well-being. Each episode explores valuable insights and practical strategies to help you lead a more fulfilling life. I'm your host, Katherine Hurtig. All right, today I am here with Amy Ramler. She's a psychologist at Calgary Counseling Center, and we're going to be talking about grief and loss. Now, I'm excited about this conversation because it's something I think about quite a bit, maybe more than I should, and it's like my biggest fear. So I'm really excited to pick your brain, Amy, and talk about grief and loss.
Thank you for having me. I think I've told you a few times now that I'm really excited to be here because grief is one of my favorite things to talk about and to help clients with.
You know, it's part of the human experience, but it's so painful and uncomfortable. So
yeah, and one of the things that I kind of wanted to clarify at the beginning as I start answering your questions is that there are many, many types of grief.
Of course, yeah.
And, you know, we can lose many things, lose a marriage, the possibility of having children, like a house, a community when we move, we lose friendships.
Yeah, job.
Yeah. And long-term relationships, even like the loss of a child to a custody situation. But in how I'm answering these questions, I'm specifically talking about death and that type of loss because there are differences.
I thought we would focus today. Because, yeah, you're right. Those all of those losses are really significant, and you can grieve those as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about your perspective on how grief is connected to our overall mental health and well-being?
Yeah, and I really like this question, and it's a good question because it differentiates grief from mental health. Like sometimes people think that grief is somehow a mental health disorder, but grief is a natural process of the experience of loss. And there are some common components within grief, but the expression of it will differ from person to person. Part of the expression and experience of grief can be impacted by someone's mental health. For example, if I struggle with anxiety and depression, when a grief experience comes, when death comes, anxiety and depression may be how I deal with that death and that loss. It might be amplified in order to try to manage the difficult feelings of grief.
So just kind of stronger symptoms of
possibly, like depression and anxiety are coping strategies or ways that we cope with stress. And so, of course, when there's a grief experience, then there's going to be more stress, and those things are, if we're used to using those patterns to cope, then those are probably going to intensify. Same thing, like if avoidance and procrastination are part of the patterns of someone's mental health symptoms, then those may also be ways someone copes with loss. So in short, mental health patterns, healthy or maladaptive, may be amplified through grief. So if we have healthy mental health and we have, adaptive strategies to deal with stress every day, those strategies are also going to help us when there's a loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I see, the process of navigating grief is super individual and very unique from person to person. So as a counselor, how do you go about helping people understand and manage their own unique grief experience?
I always start with normalizing grief and making sure that people know that what they're feeling is normal, how they are. That whatever their experience is the perfect experience for them. Normalizing grief and loss is the most important thing. Some people get confused and think that there's something wrong with them or that their mental health has taken a downturn. But really, at the very least, part of what they are experiencing is a completely normal response to losing something. And even though grief is a normal experience, it is important to remember that there are components of grief that are inescapably common. There's two that I focus on here, that there's suffering. that in a grief process, there is suffering. And that is, even though everyone's journey and expression of that suffering is different, that everyone experiences this suffering. And by suffering, I mean, it sucks, it's hard, or there's pain, but it's something that sucks. And if I put it really simply. And then the second is that grief is 100% unescapable as a human being. It is the most human experience you can have. Grief and death is a guaranteed experience. No one gets a pass. And this is important to acknowledge early on, because it's not to diminish somebody's experience. Everybody goes through it. That's not what that's about. It's about reminding individuals that they're not alone in that pain, and that that they're human.
I mentioned at the beginning, grief is one of my biggest fears. And I just, because I think I've experienced a version of grief and it was so painful. So the idea that you are I am going to experience that again at some point is a tad terrifying.
Of course. And that makes sense. Our human body and our nervous system is designed to keep us alive. And terror is part of what keeps us alive. Otherwise, there are people who are not afraid of death in a disordered way or just in other more adaptive ways, but that also puts them at risk then of death. Yeah.
So when you're working, if you're working with a client that is grieving, is that kind of where you start? Is normalizing what they're going through?
Definitely. And defining those, making sure those two things, the acknowledging so that they're suffering and acknowledging that this is a human experience, are kind of the starting point. And then usually also there's a component of, checking in with them of where are they at in their experience. Everybody comes in such a different place. Some people are very comfortable feeling the feelings that come with it. Other people are not at all comfortable feeling those feelings. Now we're getting into the personal element of counseling, but there's always an element of normalizing.
Right.
And making sure that people know, I guess, too, of making meaning from the experience of grief too at some point comes, if not at the beginning, but at a very basic level, there's that reflection of, if there's grief, that means there was love. And in my experience, that's a full circle. Love doesn't exist without grief, and grief doesn't exist without love. They are not separate. They are the same thing. And so sometimes that comes in early on, and other times that comes in a little bit later.
Building the meaning out of it?
Yeah. Or the experience of grief as love.
So narrowing down the concept of grief, I've read a little bit about the idea of anticipatory grief. So, my understanding of it is something's coming. You know that, if we are talking about death, maybe dealing with a loved one that's sick. So it's happening. And so you're kind of grieving before it happens. Is that right?
Grieving before the actual passing, but there's still a grief process that starts immediately when you find out that someone that you love is sick, or that it's inevitable that they're going to die in the near foreseeable future, or in a way that is predictable versus unexpected. And sometimes sometimes there's different forms of that too. Sometimes that is in preparation for some sort of known loss, like an illness, but other times too, people have it can fall into anxiety, they have anxiety about their child dying or about their parent dying, even though there's no known cause. They're just anxious about that, so they kind of go into this grief process before the person before the person has passed away.
My mom, she's in fine health, but she is getting older, and that idea of losing her, I don't know. So I feel like I'm trying to prepare for that. I feel if I read enough books or talk to my therapist, or just kind of if I have a plan, then it won't be as hard when it happens.
And sometimes that can be helpful because it gets us more present to what's needed in that moment with that person. And other times it can get in the way of life or not let us be present to the moment with that person. And
Is the process around grief
like the same, like if someone passed suddenly versus this, anticipating the event? Is it?
I mean,
how is it the same? How is it different?
Same back to those two components of like there's suffering and it's a normal human experience.
Yeah.
But in terms of like timeline or like that might, or what it looks like for each person, that's going to be different, even if it, one person dealing with a predicted illness and death and another person dealing with almost the same situation are still probably going to have vastly different experiences.
Of course, yeah.
And so the grief process, whether it's anticipated or sudden, is still going to be unique and familiar.
Yeah.
In many ways.
So if someone is facing anticipatory grief, what strategies do you kind of help them build? Like what skills do you help them build? Or how do you recommend helping them navigate the emotions around that?
Yeah, and that's going to be very specific to the situation, but a lot of support, like supportive relationships of friends, family, coming to counseling, even support groups, even like talking to strangers, like it can be very helpful. Sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers about these things because the stranger doesn't know the person you're talking about, so they're not sad about that person. So that can be helpful. Yeah, there's something called the circle of grief that's kind of been helpful in that way of where you think about the person who is going to pass away is at the middle of that circle, and then their closest relationships are like the next level of the circle, and then it keeps spiraling out. And depending on where you are in the circle, you give support to the inner circle, and you look for support in one of the outer rings of the circle. So if you're right in the middle of the circle, you're the person who's going to pass away, which is another component of this. That person's going to go through their own grief process, that they can look to support from all of those people. But wherever you are in that circle, it's really important to have supportive relationships because this is such a human experience.
Yeah.
And to stay connected and not isolate through this. That's the main tool. That
connection.
Connection.
When you work with clients, like, do you ever find them resistant to that? Like, isolating?
Yeah. And I guess I should say, when I say connection, I also mean connection to themselves and connection to some sort of meaning, connection to something bigger than them, the connection to their own beliefs about what happens when somebody dies. That type of connection, knowing themselves well around that. And the resistance is normal. I would just normalize that too, because
it's not something we want to go through.
No, and it's scary because that's the other thing, that seeing a loved one dies brings your own mortality into the picture. And so then that can trigger your own fears and anxieties, death anxieties. And so then there's, just working with whatever comes up for that person and considering that it's unique again to each person.
Mm-hmm. So I think, when we hear the word grief, I think we often think of those stages. Like we've seen that in TV and movies where people talk about the stages of grief and, going from, depression to acceptance. Are those real? Are those, quote unquote stages, are those very typical in someone's experience? Yeah,
so I think what you're talking about is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance.
Yeah.
That grouping is actually a myth. And these 5 stages were kind of taken and applied from research in the late 60s on how severely ill patients receive news of their illness. And so that's a very different experience than finding out one of your loved ones is dying.
Yeah.
But that research was then kind of just generalized
to grief overall.
Yeah. And so, but that's not how it is for people. And so but it's very well known.
It is. Yeah. I think we like to conceptualize things. It's like, oh, okay, well, this is what I can expect, this, and this. But it didn't seem like...
Yes, I think you're exactly right. Like people want to know what to expect. They want to make this predictable because it's terrifying or can be terrifying. And so if they have those 5 to look for, and then they also have something to judge like their own reactions to. It's like, oh yeah, I'm wrong. I'm not doing this right. Or like that person's wrong. They're not grieving in the right way. And that gives us a sense of control in something that's not under our control. But those stages, they were never meant to be applied to someone grieving the loss of a loved one.
Okay. Do any of your clients come in and talk about those stages and assume that they're going to experience those feelings?
Yeah, and I mean, they might experience those feelings, but in my experience, they're not in order.
Yeah.
And they are not necessarily like just experiencing one for a period of time and then moving on to the next. In one session, somebody might have all of those feelings and other experiences as well. And so I did kind of think about like if I were to, just from my own experience and my own grief process and then my experience with clients, like if I had to put things into stages of grief, I would do it a little bit more generally, like that you could put it into 3 categories of like craving for things to be different, experiencing aversion to how things are, and a neutral experience or kind of acceptance to the situation. Like at any one time, somebody is in that process, kind of in all experiences, but then it can be helpful to think about that in the grief experience too, of like, am I craving for things to be different? Because that's creating more pain. Am I avoiding what's happening? Am I averse to this thought, to this idea, to this experience? And then they might also be in a neutral place of acceptance of how things are and seeing things for how they are.
Yeah.
And all 3 of those can happen within seconds, like changing very rapidly or moving around from them. But the way that those would look in expression for each person is going to be very different. The way somebody wants things to be different and acts that out is going to be different.
Yeah. And I think another reason that it's probably a little detrimental to think of grieving in those stages is because it gives it the impression that it's linear and has an end.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is one of the special things about this type of grief, is there is a finality to it. And that's something we didn't talk about in the anticipatory grief, that often if the process has been a very long time coming, like my brother was sick for, I think, 8 years, but it wasn't until the last possibly year that it was like inevitable. Like we kind of knew that he was going to pass away, and it was a very long process, and he was in hospice for 3 months. It was very long. Hospice is usually a shorter experience, but there's lots of people describe this. There was a relief in lots of ways when he had passed, which is one of the differences then with a sudden passing away. There's usually not relief when somebody suddenly passes away versus when there's been such a long process and that grief has been anticipated and that process was started years ago. Yeah.
So I think as a society, we kind of have a perception of grief. Like I said, we conceptualize it, but that can cause people to have expectations around it, I think. I should be feeling this way. I should be experiencing it this way. How do you see that kind of play into someone's grief experience?
Yeah, and that you're talking about like kind of developing a negative voice in your head, and that might be something that has already affected their mental health in other ways, having a really highly critical inner voice. And a lot of people, when there's an external expectation, that's where that kind of critical voice comes from. Yeah. And if that judgment happens towards ourselves, it can sometimes happen towards somebody grieving, like seeing the wife of somebody whose husband's just passed away and seeing her laughing and having fun and enjoying family might not fit with that lens of what grief is supposed to look like. And
we think it should look a certain way. Yeah.
And be really uncomfortable for somebody to think that a wife could be happy after her husband passed away. Like there's those myths of those 5 stages really do impact the amount of support and in our culture and for certain people. Yeah. If someone isn't depressed or sad, then a lot of people think that there's something wrong with them or with that person or with the person they think should be grieving in a certain way, or they misinterpret the lack of big emotions to mean that they didn't care about the person, or maybe they go into shame and interpret their lack of emotion to mean that they are bad or uncaring. Yeah. And especially when shame comes up, which is fueled by a negative critic, it is really important to get support, and I encourage people to reach out for counseling if shame is there, because that's a tricky one. Shame is a trick, so it's important to get support usually in the form of professional help when there's shame there.
Yeah.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, completely.
Okay.
Yeah. No, and that word shame, that's kind of what I was thinking of, because it's, yeah, if you have this idea in your head of how you should be grieving someone or how someone else should be, then if it's not that way, yeah, there is that shame.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mentioned before that idea of grief having like being linear and having like an end date kind of thing. How do we go about supporting people who feels that pressure to adhere to kind of like a timeline around their grief?
Mm-hmm. And there is so much pressure to that. I don't know how many people I've heard, like my friends and clients say, like, I feel like I should just be over this by now. Or I feel like, or like, it's been a year. How come I am still thinking about it? How come I'm still sad? How come I still cry at the grocery store? Like, and yeah, there is no timeline for grief.
I think we probably really want there to be. Like, It'd be nice to think like, okay, after this many years, you're not going to feel bad anymore. Mm-hmm. But that's not realistic.
It's not realistic and also not appropriate. There's always going to be love for a person that you loved. And so to think that there could be, like, again, grief and love are very connected to each other. You can't have grief without love. You can't have love without the inevitable grief. And so to be able to understand that there is no timeline on it, but that you are going to see change in your grief. There's going to be a change in your grief. It's not always going to be experienced in the same way is important.
I saw kind of like a metaphor recently, and I want to see what you think of it. It was a drawing of a ball. The ball, and the ball represents grief. It was like a tiny jar around it. So the ball kind of like almost filled the jar. So, and people have this idea that the ball is going to shrink, but really you expand around it. And so there was like another picture of the black ball, and it's the same size, but it's just a much bigger jar. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think of that?
Yeah, there's definitely, I have a metaphor another metaphor that's similar to that I'll share in a second, but that's definitely my experience with watching my clients, is that they really grow and they learn how to make space for that love that is hard to feel when they're so sad. And yeah, that there's just more space as you go through grief, but the grief is always there.
Yeah.
I have another metaphor of grief as a ball, but in a box. And at first the ball, which in this metaphor, it's a little bit different. The ball is also grief, but the ball takes up the entire box, and there's a button in the box, and the ball is just constantly kind of moving around. But if you can imagine a ball that takes up the entire box, it's like constantly hitting that button in the box. If it's bouncing around on all four, it's like just always hitting the button. And that button is the grief response. And every time that button is hit, it's like it just happened again. That loss is felt fully. And when you first start grieving, whether that's in anticipatory grieving or in a sudden loss, that button is going to be hit a lot. And then over time, the ball gets smaller. And so it doesn't hit the button as much. But when the button is hit, it's still that, like it just happened, that really big grief response. Yeah. And that's been a helpful metaphor for people when they're questioning that length of time that it takes. It's like, oh, that ball is going to be there, and those strong reactions are normal and they make sense. And then I usually at some point also talk about like riding waves of grief, and lots of people describe grief as waves, that, the grief comes and you kind of allow yourself to go there, and as you allow yourself to go there, it passes and until the next wave. And sometimes there are lots of waves because it's the loved one's birthday, or it's an anniversary, or you see something that reminds you of them, and then there's lots of waves. And then other times it's like really calm seas, and they're really gentle waves that really allow you to enjoy the memories of that person. And there's different kinds of waves that hit you in grief, and they go with you through life. And
sometimes the waves are bigger and sometimes they're smaller. Yeah.
And I don't know that you ever get over losing someone. And I wouldn't want to.
No, I guess not. I want to talk about being there for someone else as they're grieving. It's definitely a position that I've been in. And I found it it was just tough. I mean, because everyone experiences it very differently, it's hard to know what someone needs. You know, you don't want to say the wrong thing, and I found myself really wanting to help them through their grief in the perfect way. One of my best friends a couple years ago lost her brother suddenly. And yeah, it was devastating. And you don't want anyone you love to feel that way. So trying to navigate how to support her, how to, give her what she needs, and also not make it about me. When I think about grief, ego often comes into it, because it's like you want to make yourself feel better by making that person feel better. But in the end, it's not about you at all. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but that's kind of...
No, that makes sense. And I think that's a really good awareness to have, is that if you are supporting someone that's kind of closer to that middle circle, then you want to make sure that you're also supporting yourself with somebody farther away than you are, so that you can be there for the person and not make it about you and not lean on that person, unless that's something. Sometimes the people in the inner circle, really, how they cope is by helping other people. So it depends. And that is one of the best ways to help someone, is to ask them what they need. Yeah. When you don't know what to say, to be able to say, I don't even know what to say right now, and I'm so glad I'm here with you in this. Yeah, it's okay to not know what to say. It's hard, and it's okay to acknowledge that you don't know what to say, but that you're glad that you can be there with the person. Yeah. If that's what they need and want.
I found myself, it was like a craving for reassurance. It's like, am I doing okay? Am I supporting you in the right way? I mean, I never said that out loud, because again, the whole process, it wasn't about me. It was, yeah.
It's okay to ask though, is there anything else I can do for you? Or what do you want right now?
What about if, not that I experienced this, but what if you're kind of met with anger when you're supporting someone?
Yeah, it makes sense that you're angry right now.
Yeah.
Validation. Yeah, it makes sense that you're angry. And if there's anything you need from me, just let me know.
Even if they're pushing you away?
I mean, yeah, if somebody's setting a boundary, then to respect that boundary is important. And to just let them know that you're there if they need you.
Yeah.
And then that's why it's, again, important to have support, right? The people supporting need support too, and being able to turn to the outer rings of the circle, or somebody that's on the just outside of what your circle is, or to get support. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a complex experience, and I don't want to reduce it to a soundbite or anything. But are there any, kind of simple strategies or practices that you recommend when someone is grieving?
Yeah, one of the most important things is allowing feelings, allowing your experience, and really getting rid of and containing that negative critic, so that you can have the experience that you're having. Again, and I encourage people to reach out for counseling support if they're not sure what this is, but where they're allowing sadness, but not letting sadness run the show, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes people need support to figure out what does it mean to allow a feeling. A lot of people think allowing a feeling is thinking about the feeling, thinking about the event, thinking, and they go to their thoughts. Yeah. And they get more and more sad. And that's when I'm talking about allowing a feeling, it's more like acknowledging the thought or idea, the experience that's there, and then going and focusing on what's happening in your body, focusing on my chest is so heavy right now, and just letting it be heavy. Oh, my hands are sweaty and hot, and just allowing those sensations to be there, and not trying to change the part in your body, and really moving attention and focus away from the thoughts, so that the feeling that exists in your body and the sensations in your body, you can go through those. The thoughts are just going to add more sensations and more feeling to the body. Whereas shifting your attention and focus to the body is going to slow things down. And that's a way to help develop tolerance for for feelings, especially hard feelings. This takes practice and some guidance, or can take practice and guidance. That's one of the main things that we work on is like how you're sad right now and how can we make it safe for you to feel sad.
That example you brought up about like, noticing, like, let's say that heaviness in your chest, like and just letting it be that way and not trying to change it. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's easy to explain, but how do you do that? Like if you're experiencing, an uncomfortable feeling, how do you not try to change that? Does that make sense?
Can you feel your hands right now?
Yeah.
And are they hot or are they cold or are they warm?
Kind of warm.
Okay. And so can you just let your hands be warm? There's nothing different to do. You don't have to try to make them hot. You don't have to try to cool them down. Just feel the sensation of warm and just keep bringing your attention back to feeling the sensations of warm. And it'll be normal for your mind to wander off. And when you wander off, come back to the sensations in your hands.
Okay. That makes sense.
Just don't change anything.
Yeah.
There's no fight.
That must be really hard to like put into practice. I mean, for something like neutral, like warm hands. But if,
It takes practice, but it is very accessible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it might take some guidance or some teaching, but it's still very accessible.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. In a recent podcast, we talked about self-compassion, and we talked about the kindness you show to yourself and like the common human experience. So does that idea of self-compassion play a role in grieving?
Definitely. And actually, that was kind of two of the parts of self-compassion I already touched on, that this is suffering. You have to acknowledge that this is suffering.
Yeah.
And that this is a human experience. And those are the first two components of self-compassion as well. And those are, they're self-compassion and compassion for others is foundational to navigating death experiences, to navigating loss. In order for there to be real self-compassion or compassion for others, we have to be free of judgment. So that critical voice that can create the unhealthy guilt or toxic shame can get in the way of self-compassion and compassion for others. And so that kind of needs to be dealt with first, like containing the critic.
Yeah.
So that self-compassion can actually be felt and used for healing. And once that negative critic is contained, then there becomes room for acknowledging, yes, this is suffering, this is hard. And then acknowledging that this is a human experience, I'm not alone in this. And then the third step of self-compassion, using kind words and kind self-talk to ourselves, to others, that can really get in once that negative critic is moved to the side and all those judgments are moved to the side.
Right.
That can be really difficult to do on your own, recognizing that negative critic. It can be very, very difficult to do on your own, especially if it is bringing up shame. Shame meaning like an underlying, like I am bad or I am wrong, something very personal like that. And I highly recommend reaching out for counseling if your inner critic is loud or if you have that shame towards yourself or even judgment like that towards others, and learning how to challenge those collective negative thoughts. I say collective as in like the myths that are out there about how things should be, right? Yeah. So challenging those collective negative thoughts so that self-compassion is more accessible and can actually be used and felt as healing.
When I thought about that question, I think, that's probably critical in the grieving process. Like the idea of being compassionate towards yourself, of course, because you're going through such a hard time, you need that. And the last thing that would be helpful is being critical of what you're going through. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there any last thing that you want to leave our listeners with? Any kind of final or anything, comforting to let them know about grief? Yeah,
I think to know that as you go through the grief process, it changes you. And the amount of strength and inspiration that I've seen clients get from allowing themselves to grieve in a healthy way is so inspiring. And I know I've been through my own grief process and I'm very grateful for the lessons and the growth that I've got from those experiences. And one of the things that I often do with clients is I encourage them to maintain a relationship with the person who's passed away. And I know I've had experiences of like, I feel closer to certain people who have passed away than I did when they were living because of the things that I've done to continue to relate to that person, even though they are no longer here.
What does that look like?
It can look at like many different things. Some of my clients have they have like rituals where they buy presents on certain days for like Christmas presents, birthday presents, that kind of thing for their loved one. Writing letters, day to day, just talking to the person. Like that's having pictures around, talking, that's actually really important, like kind of exposure to the person that's loved one that's passed away. It could look like going for a walk with this person, like in your mind, going for a walk with them, having imaginary conversations. I say imaginary very lightly because they're very real and very impactful.
Yeah.
Asking that person for advice. And in this way, you're developing a part of yourself that really incorporates that person into your own psyche. Mm-hmm. And so now, and that to me is like the best way to honor someone who's passed away, because then they're a part of you and they're actually continuing to live through you. And
they're not really gone.
Yeah. It can be very, very beautiful. Sadness can be very beautiful. Yeah.
You've been listening to Living Fully. Thanks for tuning in. This episode was produced by Nick Here, Louisa Campos, Jenna Forbes, and by me, Katherine Hurtig. A special thanks to Amy Ramler. To stay up to date on our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe. We're available in your favorite podcast app. Living Fully is a production of Calgary Counseling Centre and recorded in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. Living Fully podcast is not a substitute or alternative for professional care or treatment. Calgary Counseling Centre and Counseling Alberta provide effective counseling for anyone in Alberta with no waitlist and no financial barriers. Find us online at calgarycounseling.com or counselingalberta.com. For help across Canada and the United States, call 211. If you are outside of Canada and the US, seek help from your general medical practitioner.